pretty clear that the people he has assembled around him on foreign policy do have a fairly coherent and consistent idea about it, which is to withdraw militarily from the world in general, not entirely, not entirely. Now, they do want, as he has said repeatedly, to bomb the shit out of ISIS. I don't see any difference there among them. But it seems to be limited to that. And, the number one issue for me in the election was whether we were going to go to war with Russia. I mean, no one seemed to care except for the liberals toward the end who were actually calling for war with Russia. But to me, that was really terrifying. Russia is a declining power, but it does still have the second largest military in the world. And Hillary was clearly calling for war with Russia. That's what a no-fly zone constitutes. It meant shooting down Russian planes if they didn't stand down. And
in Syria, she was calling for a no-fly zone where Russian planes are essentially patrolling the skies for Bashar al-Assad, the dictator or president, whatever, leader of Syria. Do you, so you're happy, and I like the way that you're putting it, that, isolationism is okay when it comes to foreign policy. With trade and immigration and kind of other kinds of cultural ties with the world, it's kind of fucked up.
It's terrible.
Do you, who are his advisors? Can you talk a little bit about them, and why does that fill you with kind of, a sense of calm that they actually do want to pull back America's military footprint from the world somewhat?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. So I started to do, I had done some research on this during the campaign, but I really did a deep dive when I saw reports last night that Newt Gingrich was going to be his Secretary of State, which immediately, has told me, oh my God, the neocons are going to take over. In fact, that was my main concern about Trump, was that there was going to be basically a vacuum in the foreign policy establishment because he knows nothing about the world and would depend on advisors. So my fear was that the same thing would happen with Bush, right? Which was that the neocons saw this opportunity and leapt on it and took over and ran us into the ground. That's not going to happen in this case. In fact, as anyone who's followed it knows, the neocons hate Trump's guts, which was one reason.
They were the never Trumpers, really. I mean, both the hawks at National Review and especially at Weekly Standard. Yeah.
So this is fantastic news for us in the world. And so Newt Gingrich, everyone should read. He did a very lengthy interview with the Washington Times or Examiner, I forget which one, in 2013, in which he thoroughly, aggressively repudiated neoconservatism and foreign military interventions generally. He gives a robust isolationist argument in that interview. And he repeated it on Sean Hannity in May of this year.
Wow.
To Sean Hannity's face, he said the Bush doctrine was a disaster. He said even the Afghanistan war has given us nothing. He said the Iraq war was a terrible mistake. We have lost blood and treasure to these things. He calls for a withdrawal from, he says the United States should stop thinking about exporting democracy because that project has not worked. I mean, it was a phenomenal thing. Now, Newt Gingrich is a sociopath, generally.
Right. And it could have been, if he had been sitting in the same position for 30 minutes, his blood sugar might have spiked. We don't know if this actually represents what he thinks on a full belly.
Right. So who knows? But it's odd that he would choose that for political advantage in 2013. I don't know why it would serve his purpose then. And he repeated it 3 years later on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News. Yeah. Then I thought, well, maybe this is just a one-off within his foreign policy advisors. No, it's not true. So the core, and this is really interesting, the core apparently in Trump's foreign policy ideas comes from this guy who's 30 years old named Stephen Miller, who is Jeff Sessions' main aide on main advisor on foreign policy. Sessions has sort of taken the lead role in Trump's foreign policy team. This guy Miller is a 30-year-old kid, Jewish, from Santa Monica, went to Santa Monica High School, which is where my son goes. His mentor, Miller's mentor, is David Horowitz, the notorious ex-communist who became a right-winger in the 1980s, whose son was a friend of mine at Berkeley High School. Horowitz is a catastrophe when it comes to Middle East policy, and I think Trump's policy will be either equally as bad as Obama's or worse.
Well, and can I also point out that David Horowitz wrote a book that came out 68, 69, 70, something like that, New World Colossus, which was one of the great Summa pieces, an indictment from a new left position of American foreign policy as a form of imperialism. And obviously he grew on from that to becoming really the cartoon version, the gargoyle version of himself in terms of politics.
So here, as I understand, is Horowitz's main difference from the main neocons, which is that they all agree that every Arab who has bad feelings about Israel should be destroyed tomorrow. However, Horowitz seems to be only interested in that area, in protecting Israel and destroying Arab opposition to Israel. I do know for sure, because Miller has said this many, many times, his protege Miller, who's Trump's main advisor on foreign policy, apparently, for many reports, is only interested in attacking ISIS and wants the United States to withdraw from the rest of the world generally. On top of that, there is consistency among Sessions, Miller, and Gingrich, and Trump, that the United States should cooperate with Russia rather than fight Russia. Now, that definitely made me sleep better last night, but it's not the greatest thing in the whole world, because what they're calling for is a joint Russian-U.S. operation against ISIS, which is essentially a multilateral escalation of the war on terror.
Right.
However, the good news there maybe is that many analysts of the region are saying that ISIS may not survive as a military organization by the time Trump is in office. They're being destroyed right now in these cities, and as an effective organization, there may be nothing to bomb the shit out of by the time Trump gets there. There will always be an ISIS, as long as the United States is intervening in the Middle East in some form or another, mostly in little cells around the world, which that could be the end of this war still. But I don't see with Trump right now. I really don't. I don't see a war with Russia, and I don't see greater interventionism generally outside of that little pocket of the Middle East.
So, and in the piece that you wrote for Reason about Hillary Clinton, and I think the exact title is something like Hillary Clinton's Dangerously Coherent Foreign Policy, you talked about how Donald Trump will definitely be worse, or almost certainly would be worse in the Middle East than Hillary Clinton, but that would be the limit of it, because Hillary Clinton actually does have this thought-through kind of systematic or systemic foreign policy that she talked about in the last, or one of the presidential debates, about how we really have to go everywhere and pay any price, a kind of Cold War mentality that the U.S. has to be at every battle over the anywhere in the world. So you're saying essentially that Trump is the kind of the answer to it.
Yeah, well, the word that they use, that the Trump people, Miller, Gingrich, Sessions use, is globalism. That's their enemy.
Yeah.
So, again, these guys are isolationists. They really, the term acts them.
Let's talk about this a little bit, because you also mentioned, so Jeff Sessions is having an outsized influence on Trump's foreign policy. He's also the architect of Trump's immigration policy, and he's the worst person in the world, certainly in the Senate, about immigration and about getting rid of people. He's shown, he's the senator from Alabama, he doesn't care about rounding up illegals who are helping to Alabama businesses and orchards and whatnot to bring their crops to market. He hates immigrants. Apparently he hates intervention. He's not a free trader. Is there a way to separate out say the non-interventionism or the isolationism of Trump from those other things? Because if we do get a new Smoot-Hawley, high tariffs, if we do create endless trade wars with countries, if we're in the Middle East partnering with Russia, I mean, can this actually turn out well for America as a nation?
Well, like I said, this is about what the president actually has the power to do. So in foreign policy, he has tremendous autonomous power, and that's what's so dangerous. And by the way, that's power basically been given to presidents under the most liberal presidents, right? This is Wilson, Roosevelt, Johnson, and Obama in particular. Not all of them. All of them did in the 20th century, but those in particular expanded executive power, in particular on foreign policy. So that's really the danger, and we need to be critiquing that every single day. We need to be reducing that power the president has in foreign policy. But so this is very good news, though. I mean, that where Trump has the most power is where he is closest to our position. right?
So what about let's talk about Russia. Is it simply that contemporary foreign policy strategists and theorists and policymakers, is it that they are simply still locked? They've never moved on from the Cold War effectively, where there's Russia and the rest of Europe. We know what side we're on. We're in NATO, which did not disband after the Soviet Union collapsed. Is it going to sit well with them that we suddenly, if Donald Trump is like, you know what, I don't really give a shit about Russia and their ambitions, within a European sphere of influence or other places?
Yeah, there's going to be a new fight, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. And this will only be in Washington, D.C., which is it will be the Clintonian, Obama, Wilsonian Democrats, which is most of the Democrats, versus these Trump isolationists. So I mean, the Democrats and a wing of the Republican Party who are still interventionists as well.
Where does somebody like Dick Cheney? Dick Cheney was one of the few Republicans, and I think he was the only Republican vice president who's still alive who was like, yeah, I'm voting for Trump, and I'm not apologizing for it, and yet he was, by many accounts, the architect of George Bush's interventionism. Says he would do it again in a heartbeat, never seemed to have a problem with sending other people into war. Where is he in this kind of scheme of things?
Yeah, I mean, so Cheney's hard to read on this. Actually, I was never convinced that he was actually a globalist. I think he may have been more in the Horowitz camp of just wanting to protect Israel. Or of securing the Middle East, right, and securing the flow of oil. I think Cheney was in some ways a Kissingerian realist, in that he just wanted the United States to maintain its power geopolitically and to maintain control of that oil supply.
Can I ask, how do you make America great again? Which for all of the 20th century, or certainly after World War I and World War II, that was contingent on us being the greatest military power in the world. Does Trump understand that make America great again? Then if he's talking about a version where he's making America rich again, perhaps, or he thinks it is by cutting it off from the world. But isn't national greatness kind of tied up in the idea of the projection of American military power around the globe?
Yeah, I mean that's the way that the DC elites have thought of it for about a century.
Yeah,
this is true. You're right, and he's running counter to this. So
let me just to kind of get your sense on this. He's also talked about how we're going to have the best weapons. We're going to have the newest weapons. We're going to have the shiniest weapons. He said he would break the sequester, which took a nickel and a dime out of the Pentagon budget for a year. I guess what I'm asking is, and you've said that when you look at it, there's a coherence behind it, but does he understand there's a coherence behind it? Or is this just kind of where he throws a lot of stuff into the pot and then hopes that it makes a stew that you can stomach? Because why would we, if we're pulling back from the world, would we be pulling back bases? Would that be seen as a retreat by him? What happens when Putin moves fully into the Ukraine or starts sticking around with other parts, the Balkans, Baltic states? Will that be seen as an insult that needs to be avenged?
No, I think he'll let Putin have what he wants in Eastern Europe. That's pretty consistent. And by the way, there's another major foreign policy advisor for Trump that everyone should look at, named Michael Flynn, who was one of the head of the intelligence division under Obama, who was fired by the Obama administration for blowing the whistle on Obama arming the bad guys in Syria. And so he's actually been a regular guest on RT network over the year and has made very friendly noises about Putin. And so they're pretty consistent on this. Yeah. I mean, it seems to be that they're going to be very cooperative with Putin.
If you could talk a little bit about, do you proceed from a position that foreign policy is not a place for kind of individual morality, or that the language of morality when applied to foreign policy is used almost exclusively to get us into stupid and unwinnable situations? But One of the arguments that people, the anti-Trumpists talk about is that he's awful. He'll give all of this power and all of this leeway to Putin, who is a tyrant, who's already destroying his own country, and is on the march. And that because we have certain commitments to the Baltic states, to post-Soviet nations in the former Soviet Union, that we would be reneging on American exceptionalism if we just turned a blind eye to let Putin and Europe kind of fight its own battles.
Yes, we would. My whole book that I'm working on now, basically, the argument is against, yes, you're right, at its base, these moral claims that have been made about the world by the architects of American foreign policy for the last 120, 30 years. There's this amazing thing that happened at the turn of the 20th century where a lot of American elites said, we are actually obligated to uplift not just our own people, but everyone all over the world. We lay claim to every piece of land on Earth. And so whenever there is a dictator or tyrant who we don't like, who does things that we don't like in any part of the world, we are obligated to remove him. That has been the strategy, the intention, the world plan for every president except for a handful since then. And that has led us into killing several million civilians and about 500,000 Americans in the process, and doing great damage otherwise. Now, Trump is the first president. He is the first president to call bullshit on that very claim that we have any moral standing, any moral reason, obligation to help anyone in the rest of the world. And in doing so, I think he may do great service for actual peace, believe it or not.
So talk, if you can, how did this play out in, in primary politics? It's clear that Republicans in general are have been hawkish for a long time. At least Nixon, or as a counter to McGovern, was the peacenik. Republicans, especially under Reagan, and since Reagan, have been the holy boys for the war. Democrats go back and forth, and Bernie Sanders, obviously not a Democrat, running as a Democrat and an independent, was very critical of Hillary Clinton's foreign policy. But then he folded the tent on that when he got his $15 minimum wage and free in-state college tuition, and he never really mentioned foreign policy again. Is there a sizable group in the Democratic Party that actually will have to understand that they're with Trump, they're with him on this? And are there Republicans who are not, I've met a lot of kind of old rightist types who are, we should never have been in the first Gulf War, much less the invasion of Iraq in 2003. How is this going to play out? Because it's the cognitive dissonance here is pretty staggering.
Yeah, within the Democratic Party, I see almost no evidence that they will go along with Trump on foreign policy. In fact, all I have seen in the last year is people in the Democratic Party being horrified that Trump wants to, quote, withdraw from the world or, quote, support Putin's intentions in the Eastern Europe or in the Middle East. They have always been globalists. And by the way, this thing about George McGovern being the peace candidate is about half bullshit. So George McGovern, if you actually look at his career and his ideas about the world, he was a globalist. He was a moralistic globalist Wilsonian, always. His problem with the Vietnam War was the same problem that Obama had with Iraq, which was not that the United States shouldn't do these wars across the world, but they should do them intelligently. That Vietnam was an unintelligent war that was self-destructive. It was actually
if we do it smart, then it'll all work out.
American imperialism. It was
like all the other times it did.
That was Obama's critique of Iraq, right?
Yeah.
And so these guys, and by the way, Bernie's the same way. He wants to influence the whole world through foreign aid primarily, globalist, but he also wants to continue the drone war. So he's laying claim to the way people live across the world as well. I don't see any truly anti-Wilsonian, anti-globalist faction in the Democratic Party.
Do you think that Trump is, this is not a temperament question per se, but is he capable of following, a line of thought in policy? And we don't know. I mean, there's some suggestions from his business practices and whatnot, I suppose we could look at, but he's never held office. Or is he going to be the dog that is constantly seeing a flash of red somewhere and chasing after different things? Because on the one hand, he literally says, we're going to bomb the shit out of ISIS. On the other hand, he's like, hey, you know what, we shouldn't even be involved in this. So, you're betting that he and the team of advisors and the policymakers that he's put around him are going to be pretty consistent on this.
Well, yeah, at least in the people who
Wookie Dicky
foreign policy, they are coherent and consistent, at least, I will say, over the last year or two. I mean, Newt Gingrich before 2013 was a nightmare on foreign policy. But, recently he's been very, very good, actually.
What is the appeal, to the extent, and I don't think it's fully clear, the capsule summary of this election is that Trump won by appealing to white working class people, less educated people, obviously racist and sexist and homophobic and xenophobic and, just terrible human beings. Is there a reason to believe that they also support an end to overseas intervention? Because when you look at certain surveys of kind of white working class votes, they're the ones, winning wars overseas and being able to send their kids off to be blown into torsos, and to spill blood on foreign sand. That's part of why they love America. Is there a reason to believe that, these people who, provide the bodies for wars really also were saying, yeah, that's part of what I like about Trump?
Yeah. So the idea that we have a moral claim, a moral obligation to uplift the world, comes out of universities. Mm-hmm. This is the progressives came up with that idea. These were all academics, basically, or people who were bred in elite Ivy League schools, right? Trump's base was who? It was non-college educated people. I actually think this election was primarily about a battle between the hardcore Trump supporters who were non-college educated people, not acculturated to that world, in which we all talk about the poor people of the world and what we must do to save them. And the people who come from my world, right? These liberal elite colleges who have these grandiose ideas about uplifting the savages. I think that was actually the battle that we just had, and I think the people outside of colleges won this battle, and at least for foreign policy, I think that's a good thing.
Talk a little bit about how can America, or and maybe you think that just as we don't have a military path to bettering the world, or we shouldn't use the military, we shouldn't be overly concerned with the rest of the world. But I know that you like the idea of America as a place where people pour in and out and kind of mix and hybridize and mongrelize, and that free trade and free immigration or migration of people is a good thing. What are the ways, absent military intervention and kind of old-style foreign aid, which everybody knows doesn't work, what are the ways that America can actually have a beneficial effect on parts of the world where people are either not doing so well or are in despotic regimes where they're simply not allowed to actually express themselves in any meaningful way?
Simple. Open borders and free trade. That has always been the answer. When the Jews in the 1930s were asking to come to the United States said sorry. Right? That would have been the answer to the Holocaust. If the United States and the West had opened their borders, that would have been the answer. At the very same time, inside Nazi Germany, there was a gigantic love of jazz music and Hollywood movies that the Nazis desperately were trying to suppress, which they couldn't, because they knew that people loved that stuff, that pleasure and that freedom in those musical forms and that art form, much more than the discipline that the Nazis were, right? The United States never even occurred to them, right, to just call for free trade in that. They wanted free trade in other ways, but not in what was really bringing down authoritarian regimes. Same thing happened in the Soviet Union. Same thing is happening in Iran right now. Same thing is happening in Saudi Arabia. Same thing is happening in Iraq. The products of our popular culture is what those regimes are actually most worried about. That's what really subverts them from within. And all we need to do, we don't need any policy at all except a lack of policy. We need no policies governing the borders, no policies governing trade. Let it go and the people will be free.
I am fond of saying that, there was at least one revolution named after the Velvet Underground and absolutely none named after Van Cliburn, who was America's high culture export during the Cold War. And I think you're onto something. Let me ask a final question. So, that's your vision of, let them in. And let people come here, let people flirt, let people mix. Trump is antithetical to that in a way, and say with the Syrian refugees, this is one of the things that drives me nuts about him, is to the extent that he recognizes we fucked up the Middle East, and he said at various points, whether he's talking about Libya or Iraq or Syria, at various points he said, we destroyed this place. And then but then at the same time, he's like, oh, and we're definitely not letting any Syrians in because they're all, they all hate us because we destroyed their homeland. How is there a way that you're looking towards getting him to understand you can have one or the other? You can retreat from the world but invite people into your house, or that it's kind of a terrible thing to go into a region and destroy it and then tell people, sorry, you're not allowed in the country that helped destabilize your entire life.
Yeah, by the way, unfortunately, that Trump's argument about the refugees is actually the argument taken up by a lot of right-wing libertarians and paleo. In particular, Justin Raimondo and people over there. I mean, that's his argument. He says, well, it's just too late. We can't let them in because we did fuck it up, and it's our fault that we did that. But we can't let these people in because, in fact, they hate us now because of American foreign policy. So there is a logic to that I do respect. But my God, I mean, to not let people in, I can't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't. I don't know what to say beyond that, except that in general, I do know that open borders and free trade has, caused more human liberation and prosperity than anything else.
Yeah.
So, there's just no way I can bomb someone's country and then not let them in.
In our next conversation, I spoke with healthcare expert Michael Cannon of the Cato Institute. I started by asking him what Trump can do to fulfill his campaign promise to dismantle Obamacare.
He could do four things, starting today if he wanted to. He could announce that the subsidies that a federal judge has ruled violate the Constitution that the Obama administration has been giving to insurers participating in Obamacare. He could say, we're going to respect that judge's ruling, we're not going to appeal that ruling, those subsidies are going to end on this date certain. So insurance companies are not going to be getting those billions of dollars. He could say that the other premium subsidies, those are the cost sharing reduction payments. He could say there's other premium subsidies, the reinsurance payments that the GAO said the Obama administration is illegally diverting to insurance companies participating in Obamacare, $3 billion so far. He's going to say the GAO has ruled those are illegal, those payments are going to stop. He could say we are going to fight vigorously the lawsuits that insurers have filed against the U.S. government to try to get even more money because they're participating in Obamacare. Whereas the Obama administration said we might settle them and give the insurers a big payout, he could say we're going to fight those vigorously, the insurers are going to get nothing. And finally, he could say that the exemption that Congress has been getting from Obamacare will end on January 20th of 2017.
Yeah.
He does those four things, then I guarantee you Congress is going to reopen Obamacare in early 2017 and likely repeal it. And so, but the reason is that by doing those things, by ending these illegal bailouts and the illegal waiver or the illegal exemption that Congress got from Obamacare, he's going to be building a lot of pressure in Congress to do something, putting a lot of pressure on them to do something, really just by implementing Obamacare the way it was written.
Right.
And showing him that it's unsustainable and it's going to collapse. Now, what should they do? How should they replace Obama? Well, that's going to be the harder part. And it's going to be harder because the dominant Republican idea right now, or I should say one of the two dominant Republican ideas right now, is basically to replace Obamacare with Obamacare Light. A lot of Republicans, including House Speaker Paul Ryan, have coalesced around this idea that once you get rid of Obamacare, you should create this thing called a health insurance tax credit, where the government reduces your tax liability by a set amount if you buy a government-designed health insurance plan. But think about this. The government is defining what kind of health insurance you have to buy, telling you have to either buy that or you'll pay more money to the IRS, And because these so-called tax credits are refundable, that means that a lot of people who don't owe money to the IRS are just going to get a check from the government. So you've got a lot of redistribution in there. You're basically recreating Obamacare with a Republican imprimatur.
And does it have, it doesn't have an individual mandate per se, but it really kind of loads the scales towards buying?
Well, they don't call it an individual mandate, but it really is an individual mandate because it operates exactly the same. They're doing it under the tax power, so Chief Justice Roberts would approve. And creating a penalty on people who don't buy a government-designed plan. It's going to give the government as much control over your health insurance policy as it has under Obamacare. There's going to be as much redistribution as there is under Obamacare. And they're even mimicking the centerpiece of Obamacare, which is its pre-existing conditions provisions. That's just code for a scheme of government price controls. Republicans are advocating, not just Republicans, but conservative think tanks like some folks at the American Enterprise Institute are advocating that Republicans mimic Obamacare's community rating price controls by creating so-called continuity of coverage price controls that prohibit insurance companies from charging actuarially fair premiums if people switch plans.
Wow, so it's kind of like rent control for healthcare, or rent stabilization. What is the other Republican plan? And we should point out that the Republicans took their sweet time coming up with, actual replacement plans. But what's the other main Republican idea?
Well, healthcare has never been a Republican issue, and you can see it in the ideas that they put forward. They mimic Democratic approaches to healthcare so closely. That's why I think the members of Congress who have introduced the second approach.
Oh, I want to get beat
really
by a child.
They are Jeff Flake, Republican senator from Arizona, Dave Brad, a Republican member of the House from Virginia, the one who ousted Majority Leader Eric Cantor. They've introduced a bill that would expand health savings accounts, but they would expand health savings accounts in a way that could totally revamp the way the federal government taxes healthcare, or more precisely, penalizes people if they don't buy a government-designed plan. And in effect, what this approach, this HSA expansion approach, could do is effectuate a $9 trillion tax cut. $9 trillion is the amount of my earnings and your earnings and everyone else's earnings that we have to surrender to our employer and let our employer use to choose our health plan. They do that because there is another penalty, another mandate in the tax code that says either you give your employer this money or you have to pay higher taxes. Well,
and by that you mean in saying that what you're pointing out that what our employers spend on health care we do not get taxed on as if it's regular compensation.
That's correct.
So in creating the HSA this way, we actually get to continue to spend money on health care without being taxed on it as compensation.
But the way to understand that supposed tax break is that the federal government is basically telling you got to give $13,000 of your income to your employer. You've got to surrender that to your employer and let them use that to choose your health plan. Because if you go to an employer, instead you want that money as cash, you get that money from your employer as cash, we're going to penalize you by taxing that money, subjecting it to both payroll and income tax. So that's a huge tax penalty unless you give your employer control of $13,000 of your income. That doesn't sound like a tax cut to me. That sounds like a tax. And you add up all that $13,000 across all the workers over the next 10 years, and it adds up to $9 trillion. So what the Flake-Brad approach would do is it would allow people to control $9 trillion of their income that they currently cannot control. In effect, a large tax cut, but without increasing their tax liability to the federal government at all. And then they could choose a health plan that stays with them from job to job. a health plan that they like rather than one their employer likes.
Do they subject the health plans to any kind of certification process to say that it meets certain minimum requirements or government mandates?
Anytime you have any sort of subsidy or tax credit, the government has to define what is eligible for that tax credit. So if people want to take their money at $13,000, put it into a large HSA, large health savings account, and then use it to buy health insurance tax-free, yeah, it's got to meet a government definition of what is a health insurance policy that's eligible for tax-free HSA purchase. However, that's different. So it's similar in concept to the health insurance tax credit, as likening to the individual mandate, but important in a couple of, or different in a couple of very important respects. One of them is that because you would have the option not to buy health insurance and save that money tax-free in your large HSA, that mandate or that government definition of what you of qualified health insurance is much less scary. And because you can do that, because you have that freedom, that definition is going to be less burdensome because providers and others won't have the incentive to lobby Congress to require you to buy coverage for acupuncture and mental health and alcoholism and drug abuse coverage and other things that contraceptive coverage, other things you may not want, because they can't be sure that you're then going to buy that coverage because you'll have the freedom not to buy it and save your money tax-free. So does it completely eliminate the tax code's role in healthcare? No, but it is a dramatic step toward free markets, whereas if you repeal Obamacare and replace it with health insurance tax credit, then you're taking one step away from a government-run system and then taking that same step back toward a government-run system.
Is there what is your sense which policy or which approach is dominant among Republicans or is likely to win any kind of legislative battle, which will include Democrats as well?
I think it's really a jump ball at this point because Republicans have not coalesced around this health insurance tax credit idea, partly because a lot of them sense that this is just Obamacare-like. This is just mimicking Obamacare's major provisions, and if they fought Obamacare for 6 years just to repeal it and then implement it themselves.
Duh.
I think that the
Did you not know that? Oh boy.
is much more in line with Republican and conservative and libertarian principles because it builds on something that conservatives and Republicans are already familiar with, which is health savings accounts. And as I said before, it does take a step toward a second step. Once you repeal Obamacare, it takes yet another step in the direction of free markets. And I think that the more they look at it, the more Republicans will sense that.
Talk a little bit about it, and we'll end with this. Why, remind us of why free markets can actually improve not only the quality but the quantity of healthcare. Now, that's something that has been lost, it seems, in many conversations over healthcare because, part of it was Democrats or supporters of Obamacare or of a single-payer plan were saying, we need the government to pay for this because it's too expensive. People on the right, oftentimes we're saying Obamacare is going to, destroy Medicare itself, a single-care payer. What is the argument about bringing market forces to bear on healthcare, which is often seen as something that is distinct in its economic structures from buying hamburgers or hot dogs or something?
Well, so healthcare in the United States is an absolute mess. We are paying way too much for what we're getting. The prices for medical services are opaque and too high. Prices for health insurance are too high and climbing too rapidly. The worst part is that the quality of care, the quality of health insurance is so poor, and especially with health insurance, it's getting poorer as a result of Obamacare. But the great virtue of the U.S. system is that because it is so fragmented, there are corners where we don't have one great big government-run program for everybody. there are corners of the healthcare sector where market forces have been given room to breathe, where we have a whole panoply of government programs and tax preferences, or tax penalties really, and mandates and regulations and so forth that have completely distorted the market and inhibited market forces. But there are some corners where market forces have been given room to breathe, and they have produced amazing things. Amazing innovations that show that markets can reduce prices and improve quality at the same time.
What's an example? Okay, yeah.
Two examples. Out in California, some insurers did an experiment where they said to people who were getting colonoscopies or getting knee replacements, here's how much and that's how much we're going to pay. And if you want to pay more than that, you're on the hook for that. So these patients who before were totally insensitive to the cost of their knee replacements, colonoscopies, were all of a sudden asking their providers about it, and just making the patients cost conscious in that way caused price competition among hospitals and caused prices to fall by an average of about $16,000 for any knee replacement. So those are that shows you how inflated the prices are because of all these government interventions and how much market forces can bring the prices for these services down. Another example is in the market where insurers buy or where consumers buy health insurance directly from insurance companies. Prior to Obamacare, insurance companies had been innovating, and they offered, by 2008, they offered in 25 states a product that says to people, look, come to us, we'll apply for an insurance plan, we'll quote you a premium, and then you can either buy that insurance plan, enroll in it immediately, or for 1/5 of that premium, so instead of paying maybe $5,000, you pay $1,000 a year, you can buy the right to enroll in that plan anytime you want, enroll in that underlying health insurance policy anytime you want, no matter how sick you get in the meantime. So if you pay that 20% of the premium, and then you get cancer, you can enroll in that health plan paying the same premium that healthy people pay. I call it pre-existing conditions insurance. Right. And imagine how that would have revolutionized the market for health insurance for, say, college students or people who are generally healthy, don't think they may have enough stocked away for an acute medical episode, but would want to buy health insurance if they got a chronic long-term illness. Imagine how much more of the healthcare sector would be directed toward the cash market, where you have some of the cost consciousness that we saw driving down prices in that experiment in California. These are the corners of the healthcare sector where market forces have shown that they can make healthcare better and more affordable and more secure. And that is why we need to repeal Obamacare. That's why we need to replace the expanded health savings accounts. And then not even stop there. Reform the Medicare program, reform the Medicaid program, and keep on pulling government back, because the more we do, the more we're going to help the most vulnerable.
The repeal and replacement of Obamacare would be a bright spot. But will President Trump follow through on his disturbing law and order rhetoric and all it implies for civil liberties and criminal justice reform? I talked to LA-based defense attorney Ken White, who has a large following at the Pope's Law blog, about what a Justice Department headed up by someone like Rudy Giuliani might look like. There's a lot of reason for concern.
Well, it can get bad. It can get bad on a number of levels. First of all, you're setting the priority for federal prosecutions across the country. There are a lot of U.S. attorneys out there, and they have very limited resources. Unlike the various DA offices that basically have to take all comers, if you shoot someone, they don't get to decide. We're not going to use our resources on this year. The U.S. attorney's offices are very choosy about what federal prosecutors do in districts. And different administrations have had different priorities. So you've seen administrations that have been concerned, for instance, about civil rights prosecution, about federal prosecutions of officers that violate suspects' rights, and of vigorous white-collar prosecutions of misconduct in the financial sector. Those are the ones that all us ex-AUSAs love, because those are the people with money, of course.
Right.
But you've also had times when the Department of Justice really revs up the incentives for higher numbers and smaller cases. So you could have a much bigger emphasis on immigration prosecutions of that sort of thing are a drop in the ocean. Unless
All right.
massive
Oh, hello.
money, they're never going to have much more of a dent on immigration crime than they currently have on drug crime. And the other problem is every time you shift priorities, you take away money from types of prosecutions you might want to see more of. So when you hear complaining that no one in the financial industry was prosecuted after the 2008 crash, well, they're not likely to be if you have U.S. attorneys' offices where the white-collar crime is minimally staffed. But then you also have direct ideological type things. It's certainly possible to use the Department of Justice to go after an enemies list. We have in Mr. Trump someone who suggested that he put his opponents in jail, and he's certainly capable of.
Do you as a lawyer do you take that seriously, or is that just kind of a barstool bully letting off steam?
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't think we'll know till it happens. I think it's possible it's just steam. I think it's possible that he'll do something. But I mean, the Obama administration showed us with the IRS it's perfectly possible.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Parts of the government to harass or selectively prosecute different people based on ideology. It's also possible to have what I would characterize as sort of bizarre priorities, like Ashcroft, as Attorney General, famously tried to ramp up all the obscenity prosecutions, right. And during the Bush administration, there was a fair amount of emphasis on finding the most outrageous porn you could, trying
right.
to get someone in a very conservative community to buy it, and then federally prosecuting that person,
and then losing the case. I mean, I guess they won one high-profile case, and then they lost another that they bizarrely took against Joe Staliano, a porn producer who has been a donor to Reason Foundation, but then they tried it in Washington, D.C., and when it came to the jury, the judge wouldn't even let the jury he wouldn't even let the Staliano's people present a defense, because it was like, you haven't even made a case here. But that's what you get, right? Like that's the president can be, they appoint an attorney general, and the attorney general, can start saying, what, we need more prosecution of kittens, Mexican kittens and chihuahuas. They're coming across the border, and that's going to have a major effect. I assume then that you are cautiously pessimistic, given that Trump, in the rhetoric, he talked a lot about crime in the streets, which is mostly in his head. Crime is at or near historic lows in most major metropolitan areas and throughout the country, but then also talking a lot about immigration. That seems like something that he might be investing a lot of energy and power into.
Well, he has relatively little influence on crime in the streets, in the sense of that's overwhelmingly policed by state and local forces, which most likely he knows he doesn't control. And he can certainly have a policy agenda on that, trying to get Congress to give more tax money to the police departments. He can go around the bully pulpit. He can even try to do things like use the mechanism of the Justice Department to go after groups like Black Lives Matter on the theory that they're somehow part of a national conspiracy with police, which I think would be very abusive, whether or not you agree with everything Black Lives Matter does. So the mechanisms are there, but I think that generally the system trends more towards dysfunction and incompetence than it does towards effective manipulation. And my hope is more of a law and order regime where he talks big and has big dreams but can't really accomplish much of anything. And I'm hoping that's a more realistic outcome than a genuinely Nixonian, let's use the mechanisms to go after people, or like the IRS recently against conservative groups.
Now, do you think, with one of the interesting stories about this campaign really is the role that WikiLeaks might have played in convincing people or hardening people's convictions that Hillary Clinton is, if not quite doing illegal things, is kind of a shady character and a liar who to say one thing to a private audience and something else to a public one. What happens? Like, are we in a world now where if the government starts to go after conservative, or I guess maybe in this case it would be liberal or progressive groups, kind of in a Nixonian fashion, and Trump has certainly kind of flashed his leg on that a little bit. Will it be easier or harder to find out? Because one of the things that this election may have hinged on is a kind of involuntary transparency that freaks people out for all sorts of reasons. I think it freaks out individuals, it freaks out corporations, it freaks out whole governments. Do you feel like we'll be better prepared to look for that kind of pattern of prosecution, or the goods, like the secret emails that prove something?
I don't think we will. I think we'll be in a worse place, and this is why. I think we're much more used to the government and the law enforcement using leaks than being held back by them. So, one of my pet peeves with journalism is the tendency to accept leaks from law enforcement to talk about defendants or suspects and not report on the story that is the fact that law enforcement is leaking this to hurt the defendant and help the case, which to me is part of the story.
Right.
I think that we'll continue to see leakers and the press they leak it to be willing to accept leaks uncritically, and that's generally work to the favor of law enforcement, because there's this mentality that what's in the leaked news and the fact of the leak or how it happened or why it happened isn't.
Chuggy Buggy Bongo!
An example of that, Nick, that to me really sums up my feeling about the relationship between law enforcement and the press. My partner represented a controversial local politician, always in the news, and the DA's office charged him and showed up to arrest him at his house early one Friday morning. And of course, they tipped off the Los Angeles Times. The Times sent a reporter and a photographer, but they got there a little late. The local politician was already in cuffs in the car. The reporter complained about it.
Well, traffic is hell in LA. So.
Yeah, you guys are early riders, sure. So they walked the guy back into his house and then turned him around and walked him back in cuffs into the car so that they could get photographs of it. And the Times ran it.
Without mentioning that they had reenacted the scene?
Correct. Because to the press, the money shot of the perp walk was news, and the willingness of the cops to stage it for them was not news.
Jeez.
I think we need both a public and a media that is willing to question that read of things. Because sometimes in Wen-Ho Lee, in any number of other cases...
Right, and just to remind people, Wen-Ho Lee worked at Los Alamos, I believe, was it? He was of Chinese American or Chinese descent, and he was fingered during, was it the Bush years or the late, it was the late Clinton years, right?
I believe it was the late Clinton years.
Yeah,
and
with
basically
trafficking, giving away secrets to the Chinese government, and it looked, he was, putting the slammer and all of that, or was going to be, and it turned out to be a completely evidence-free case against him that seemed rooted in kind of racial or ethnic paranoia.
Yeah, and basically the government used judicious leaks to the media to whip up public opinion against him and ruin his chance of ever getting a fair trial if it had gotten that far. Or, Richard Jewell, described as the Unibubba and through leaks as the guy who committed the Atlanta Olympic bombing when, of course, he had nothing to do with it. And it goes on and on. All the time, I think the media is willing to be used as a tool and is too wedded to the idea that, well, if it's a fact they're giving me, it's a fact they're giving me, and the public has to know, and there's no ethical or practical or political weight to the fact that they're leaking it to me. And I question that premise.
Yeah.
And I guess to come back to your original question, I'm very skeptical that right now we will see leaks that will help defend against a out-of-control Justice Department as opposed to assist it.
And even though the press, I mean, I guess in two ways, the press itself, and you could see this on the every cable network with the exception of Fox last night. I mean, people almost weeping. I thought Brian Williams was, going to pull a Bud Dwyer at some point on MSNBC. They were very mad, and very upset by the rise of Trump. They dislike Trump, but that will not, or maybe it's just the talking heads, but that won't filter into an operational shift where the press actually becomes more of a watchdog organization rather than a kind of lapdog enabler of government overreach.
Right, and I don't see anything from WikiLeaks that indicates to me that they're likely to be even-handed either.
And do you think, I mean, this is an interesting question, that Trump on a certain level and his supporters, they rose to prominence and ultimately to electoral victory by saying, you know what, we're calling bullshit on the media. The mainstream media, the lamestream media, with the exception of the great good journalists at Breitbart, are all full of beans and we don't believe a word you say. That is not going to transfer into a broad-based skepticism of what President Trump starts enacting, I assume.
I don't think people's minds are going to work that way. I think that he has very successfully trained his followers to, think that if it's anti-Trump, if it's not supportive of Trump, then it's not credible. And that's going to be very useful to him.
Dang it, Colonel and Josie and me. Why we got fail it to be? You bleed.
Dangerous to be that uncritical. I think Obama has enjoyed that type of protection for some time. I think Clinton did too, to some extent. And if you get a sufficiently aggressive president with that type of following that completely disregards the media, well, it's a matter of concern.
Talk a little bit about, people are already throwing around the idea of Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, former federal prosecutor, who in many ways kind of, perfected the perp walk on white-collar crime in New York back in the day. As Attorney General, or Chris Christie, who it would be interesting, the governor of New Jersey, who is under all sorts of attack for his involvement in various skeevy business, most prominently Bridgegate, where some of those people are sitting at a bridge in order to screw over a political opponent of Christie's. If we get he also was a prosecutor, if I'm not mistaken, but if we get a Rudy Giuliani Attorney General, is that a real problem?
Well, I think the priorities in Attorney General are more of a problem than the personality. Someone like Rudy Giuliani strikes me as someone like Trump, who is likely to do a lot of, big showy flourishes, and that would be unpleasant. But the thing we should really keep our eye on is what are the prosecution priorities, what cases do they bring, where do they shift the Department of Justice resources. I mean, Giuliani, yeah, he's the king of the perp walk. He strikes me as the type of AG who could do something like, it's typical when you're negotiating with the government for a client who hasn't been charged yet to arrange for a surrender. And I could see Giuliani doing something like, no surrenders, everyone gets arrested, and everyone gets the perp walk. That would be sort of classic, showy, look how tough we are, ask what we can do, that people like that enjoy. In terms of the substance, I mean, I'm more afraid of a quiet, efficient, capable, self-controlled Attorney General completely devoted to a bad agenda than I am to
why don't we close with, and I realize I'm going off script here a little bit, but Janet Reno, who was either the longest or second longest serving Attorney General in American history, recently died. She served under the Bill Clinton in the 90s and was pretty terrible on a whole host of issues. I suspect that you agree with that. When you look at recent attorneys general, are there any people, let's define recent by going back to the bicentennial year or something. Are there any attorneys general who you think actually perform the function in the way that it is constitutionally intended, where they actually help the federal government run more efficiently, and they're not just kind of settling scores or following their own obsessions into weird and disturbing places.
I don't know if I would hold up any and say, gosh, I wish this were the Attorney General again. I think a number of them have shown flashes of independence. I mean, certainly,
Oh no!
You were attacking journalists for going soft on a government that gives them access, but
exactly. So, but she certainly had a very troubling history, both at the beginning and the end of her term. She did do some things that were not on the agenda. She did permit investigations of which is the type of independence I'd like to see in an attorney general. I would like to.
And there was even that moment of somebody like John Ashcroft, as awful as he was in so many ways, he was on his deathbed or recovering from surgery, and he refused to sign papers that were kind of pushed in his face, right, that would have allowed for all sorts of kind of carte blanche on Bush administration hijinks.
Well, exactly, and that's why I think that I guess that would be the scariest part of a Rudy Giuliani type figure, because I would see Giuliani as likely just Trump's creature. I wouldn't really see him standing up or exercising independent judgment or contradicting him, and that would be disappointing. So I prefer that I don't think it's going to happen, but I prefer that Trump somebody, the sort of people who might question.
Is there do you have a historical attorney general?
Gosh, I'm sure if you gave me time, I'd come up with one, but I don't have one for you.
You know what? You're sounding a lot like Gary Johnson about world leaders, where I thought you would have 5, 6, 7 people, at the top of your hands. And now I'm trying to, like Nicholas Katzenbach, right? And now I'm just throwing out names, and he was terrible, right? I think he was LBJ's bagman for a while.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are all sorts of terrible ones. I mean, I guess you could say that anyone who refused to do something illegal is worth considering.
Right.
I mean, Richardson and Ruckelshaus both had their problems, but they resigned during the Saturday Night Massacre rather than take Nixon's order to fire the special prosecutor. So that at least was a moment of integrity.
If the Attorney General almost always disappoints libertarians, what about Supreme Court appointments? And how concerned should we be with Trump's utter disregard for civil liberties and the separation of powers? Georgetown law professor Randy Barnett says the rise of Trump just might inspire liberals and progressives to start believing in limiting the power and reach of government.
My pitch is simply, it's time to stop thinking that you guys are always going to be in power, because you're not. I didn't understand. It seemed foolish to abandon the rule of law because you somehow think that you're always going to be in power, and not to put yourself in the position of being under the thumb of some other guy. And Trump is almost perfect. Unfortunately, fortunately for the country, he's probably not the radical, crazy person that he himself makes himself out to be, because that's just the character he played during this campaign. And when he plays the character of president, it's likely to be a different character than the one of campaign of a candidate.
Right.
But if he really were that scary, crazy person, that's all the better kind of guy to get the left to consider restoring the rule of law, checks and balances to protect them from people like this.
Yeah. Talk a bit about the Supreme Court. We have anywhere between 0 or negative replacements to go, depending on if Trump even wants to, staff up after attrition on the Supreme Court. To it seems like everybody could be leaving now. What are your thoughts about the Supreme Court and Trump's appointees? And I'll point out that you showed up on Gary Johnson's list, the Libertarian Party candidate Supreme Court list. Did that make you feel good, or did that make you feel angry?
I went shopping for Rose because I wanted to get one before they ran out.
Yeah, that's I think hopefully you haven't worn it outside so you can return it, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, save
They
the
did
receipt.
have they had a 30-day return policy.
So what do you think this does to the future? Or what are the stakes at the Supreme Court, and where do you think Trump has given out at least two lists of potential of the types of justices he wants to appoint? What do you think of that? Is there any real philosophy or ideology there that's worth understanding?
This was always the strongest argument for Trump. It remains the strongest argument for Trump. I just looked at the list this morning. The reporters have been in touch with me. And it's a good list. I don't know everybody on the list, but I know maybe a third to a half of the people, and of the third to the half of the people I know, I think they're good people. I think they're good. And look, the way I was explaining to my students today, the way this works is all presidents outsource. In modern times, all presidents outsource judicial picking to the interest groups that really care about that issue. And presidents have their own policy agendas. For Trump, it's going to be trade and immigration. It's not the court, and that gets outsourced to people in the coalition that care about it. And this would be people who would be loosely associated, let's say, with the Federalist Society. In the left side, it's Think Progress and Alliance for Justice and those folks. People for the American Way. Those people that care about this stuff on the left. That's who gets to say depose people. And the people that have been the best thing to say about Trump, the best thing you could always say about Trump, is all the people, including the two people he named during the debate, were good people, and so therefore he's listening to people who know good people. Not that he knows. But that's what the president's never knows. The people he's listening to are apparently know who the good people are.
And by good people, how do you define a good person when you're talking about a potential Supreme Court justice? What are the contours of that?
Well, let me begin by saying the question mark in my mind, and this has always been the question about Trump and even the good people and what makes a good people. There's two kinds of conservative justices. There are the constitutional originalist justices, and then there are the judicial restraint, judicial conservative justices that believe in restraint. For way too long, Republicans have been outright seeking the judicial restraint judges who will defer to Congress and defer to the president himself. And in recent years, there's been a strong movement in favor of constitutional originalist justices, more in the mold of Justice Thomas, but perhaps even more so than he did. And this list contains people who probably are a little both. I can't be 100% sure which they are. That's what you need confirmation hearings for, by the way. But they're promising. And I think it would be a sad situation if he appoints judicial restraint conservatives, because they're the people that gave us Obamacare. And they're the people that say the New Deal is okay and we just have to hold the line here and there. And I think Republicans have, by and large, turned away from that. And my hope is that the people who will be vetting these nominees will also care about originalism at least as much as they care about restraint. And that would be a huge improvement to the Supreme Court over what we have today. So there is a potential, I'm not promising it to you, Nick, but there is a potential upside to what happened yesterday for the Constitution of the United States.
Do you worry at all? We've touched on it very lightly about libel laws and whatnot. Donald Trump, like Hillary Clinton in different ways, attacked the First Amendment. At various points he said, I want to open up the libel laws so I can sue the New York Times or Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who owns the Washington Post, when they print stories that I don't like about myself. At one point, he actually said in the same weekend in December that Hillary Clinton said that we've got to start taking over parts of the internet to rid it of sites or platforms that allow jihadists to kind of meet and mingle. Trump said exactly the same thing. He was and with his patented kind of lack of understanding, he talked about how he was going to get Bill Gates to somehow shut down parts of the internet.
I remember that.
Do you worry about kind of basic constitutional rights under a Trump presidency, particularly for things like free speech and free assembly and First Amendment issues, really?
Excuse me. Of course I do. the reason why I wasn't supporting Trump. As I said to my students today, there was an advantage being against both of these candidates, and that is that no matter who won today, there would be good news, and that is the other person lost. So I was actually much more well-suited to be in a better mood than most people around here because I was against both of them. So you're absolutely right. There's very good reason to be concerned about him. And then the question is, what is really going to be within his wheelhouse, something that he's actually going to have an interest in, that he's not going to be tied up doing other things, and that there won't be other people around him to stop him if, in fact, he does take an interest in these things from doing that stuff. And that's going to depend on his administration as much as it is on him. And yes, we should be concerned about it, and we should be watchful.
And you're banking, you're assuming, and I think there's good reason to that. He's kind of articulated trade and immigration as the things that he is most preoccupied with, which of course, particularly with immigration. What are the constitutional challenges to his promises to, and they changed over time, but to round up, 11 or 12 million people plus maybe another 4 million kids who are U.S. citizens and say they have to go?
Look, I think that at the end of the day, he has intimated so many different times that he is prepared to negotiate and bargain and reach a deal, and he's actually favored partial amnesty at times in the past, including very recently. I think the people who are counting on him to be the immigration hardliner that they would like to imagine him to be are going to be disappointed, because I don't think Donald Trump cares that much about any particular issue in college. He's a New York liberal Democrat who managed to win the Republican Party as a presidential nomination as a reality TV star. And so he ran on that issue. I believe that's an issue he will be tougher on immigration than Hillary would have been, for sure. But I think it's going to be a negotiated effort to enforce existing immigration laws, which is not as radical as it sounds to enforce existing immigration laws. I think you might have a much bigger concern, actually, on the trade area, because that's where I'm not a real expert on trade, Nick, so you might want to interview someone else about this. But from what I understand, the president has been given by Congress a tremendous amount of authority in the course of enforcing and negotiating trade agreements. And to the extent the president has discretion, this president will exercise it, and this is something he really does seem to care about. And his trade policy could end up being disastrous.
And, of course, that brings it back to the starting point of what is the relationship between the president and Congress. And obviously Hillary Clinton was talking an anti-trade line, pulling it off of Bernie Sanders and whatnot. And maybe this is the moment where the spine of Congress will be stiffened to demand that they have more say in trade policy and that it moves in a more libertarian direction.
Maybe. I'm not optimistic about this at all. I mean, we'll have to see. I mean, you're the optimist.
I am the optimist.
I always accuse me of being an optimist too, so we put the optimist. But on this particular issue, I'm not sure I see an optimistic scenario here, other than the fact that the consequences of what he says he wants to do are so predictably onerous that they're not likely to happen. But who the heck knows? We've had Smoot-Hawley in the past. We can have Smoot-Hawley again.
If you find the prospect of Donald Trump mainstreaming protectionist trade policy daunting, and you should, his statements on education policy are cause for real optimism. Education reformer Lisa Graham Keegan didn't vote for Trump, but she says the president-elect has been forceful, if vague, in his support for increasing school choice.
It is a good thing from an education point of view, and in fact that was I voted against myself, actually, because he has been good on these issues in a very vague 35,000, maybe 100,000 foot level, right? I like school choice. I like state control. So that's sort of where it started and stopped, I guess. But I do know, you have people like Gerard Robinson and Bill Evers who are good minds and practice people, and he's got some smart books going on. So, good. I mean, It is good. I think, what has to happen with the Department of Education is they've got to quit trying to be the Congress. The Congress did actually a very nice bipartisan job of rolling back a lot of the No Child Left Behind overreach, trimming that, giving it back to the states, and then the Department of Education was sort of in the process of overreaching when the election hit yesterday.
So wait,
So
tell me a little bit
about
about that. So Congress rolls back a bunch of the mandates that are involved in No Child Left Behind, which of course was cooked up by Ted Kennedy and George Bush, and other bipartisan malefactors. But you say a lot of that was peeled back, and then but the Department of Education was not with that program. They were still kind of forcing it.
Well, they were through regulations. They were coming up with a set of rules as to how to implement this rollback, which is ironic, right?
Yeah.
Let us help you with a huge set of rules besides how to liberate yourself. So the intention that the Congress put forward was basically, look, states are in charge here. Yes, you have to say how your schools are doing. That is a good idea. People have a right to know whether these are functional. But you all do that and let us know how you plan on doing it. And you need these markers. You have to tell us how different groups of kids are doing, et cetera. So all of that would have been great. And then the regulatory, what looked like a lot of overreach coming was, well, okay, in concept you can do that, but we want you to keep statistics in the following way, which basically would force a whole lot of different practices. And I know that sounds sort of vague, but basically it was trying to stick a lot of the regulation that got taken out back in. And there were a bunch of stories as recently as this week about Lamar Alexander and others who really worked on this, saying, no, that wasn't our intention. And I think you would have seen a real war had Trump not been elected.
What was Hillary proposing on the trail? And this, I know from years ago in It Takes a Village, she actually, which came out in the late 90s, just as the charter schools were starting up, she had kind words about charter schools and about school choice in It Takes a Village. And but on this campaign, during this campaign, she came out pretty forcefully against charter schools and against school choice, didn't she?
She did. So her village was the teachers union this year, was the village that it took. I mean, she went to ground. And it's too bad because, she and former President Clinton had been early advocates for just to be able to bring their skills to the market, which is what a charter school is. And so that's a shame. And it was frightening, actually. And I think we would have seen huge rollbacks in progress in marketplace education that really is taking hold in a lot of places like my beautiful Arizona. So, and it is making a positive academic difference. That's the good news.
Yeah, talk about...
So that was scary.
So, there was a recent New York Times story that talked about, not all charter schools are great, but these ones are, and they tend to demand a lot from the students. Is that, are we... I mean, is the Trump victory in a kind of interesting way? It seemed as if progressives who dislike school choice, they dislike public charter schools, they dislike any kind of messing with the status quo other than giving more money to existing kind of conventional schools, it seems. They were starting to get the upper hand on a lot of kind of propaganda. John Oliver on this last week tonight did an extended attack on charter schools as kind of being riddled with scandals and lousy results, some of which is true. Do you feel like between Trump winning and, the New York Times coming out and saying, you know what, these charter schools are actually helping the most at-risk children predictably and in positive ways, is this, does it seem like it's dawn-breaking for the school choice movement?
I hope a couple of different dawns break here, Nick, because a couple of things happened. So, yes, the president-elect is elected. So Trump gets elected. That is a pro-school choice move. The other things that happened, though, were in Massachusetts, a potential cap on charter schools did not pass. In fact, was hugely slammed by suburban parents. And in Georgia, they had sought to create an achievement district where they could sort of liberate a set of schools that were doing poorly and try to get them to be better. For me, what I hope we learn as a Republican Party is that there is a reason that your education policy should turn on marketplaces and what people want. Everybody lauded the Massachusetts charter school system because it was such high quality, sort of the Harvard of the American charter school system. But like Harvard, very few people could get in there. There were 12 schools. In Arizona, we have over 600, and we grow at 10% a year. And it took us 20 years, but the charter sector in Arizona is consistently outperforming the traditional system. Why? Because they can close themselves down. They can let people go if they're not performing. They can all the things you need to do to stay at high quality. Well, that is a result of relying on and believing that at the end of the day, the demand of parents will prevail. It will get you a better system. And I just feel like we kind of got co-opted by central planning. You know, once we figured out how some people were doing these things right, how some authorizers are getting it right, we tried to impose that on everybody. That's an incorrect response.
Right.
And so I
mean, it's
like
really, it's
so
got to,
learn.
I mean, just like, you always hear this about tech industries and other businesses that have to adapt or die. The charter school model or the school choice model has to constantly be reinventing itself in relationship to the demands of parents and having confidence that that process will turn out a better product and better experiences for kids.
Yeah, that's right. Educators actually do know what they are doing. And the other thing is you cannot limit access to new schools, to new public schools, to low-income families. You absolutely have to incentivize that. But the reason we're successful in Arizona is because wealthy families also have their kids in public charter schools, families who pull political levers. If you sit down with the chattering classes in Phoenix or any part of Arizona and you ask how many of you have your child or grandchild in a charter school, about half that room is going to raise its hand. And so it's so widely dispersed among opinion leaders that it's politically stable. When you isolate these things, Milton Friedman, programs that are determined to be strictly for the poor will inevitably be poor programs when the rest of the public decides you don't get the money.
Right.
You can't make these things charity. They have to be systemic. So, I'm excited about that, Nick. I don't know this, man. I don't know if Trump, understands markets well enough to understand. I mean, understands the markets.
But a lot of people are saying, a lot of his money comes from cutting deals with local governments and getting subsidies, et cetera. I mean, it's worrying. And certainly he doesn't have to choose between, rent payment and school tuition or anything like that. What is the role of the Secretary of Education? A couple of names have been floated. One is Bill Evers, Williamson Evers, who you mentioned before, who's been in the libertarian movement and the school choice movement and even the free education movement for decades. Another is Ben Carson. And that's kind of a head scratcher because Ben Carson.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, he's a retired neurosurgeon. So exactly what he would be able to do. But what is the principal role of the Secretary of Education, as you see? What how can they do good and how can they do bad?
I think the number one thing that person can do well, and I do think Bill Evers. The other person you didn't mention is Gerard Robinson, who's actually part of their transition team as well. So he has been a state school superintendent. Great guy. So it is the role to give voice to the president's ideology here. I always think that's the most important piece. You are the mouthpiece, if you're in that role, of the president of the United States, and in this case, his view about what should be happening in education across the country. I believe at this juncture, if people did not get the message that things should not be coming out of Washington, they were asleep between 9 at night and 3 this morning. I mean, I think that this administration has a grand opportunity to roll this back. I'm not somebody who believes you just do away with the Department of Education. All of that regulation is still in the law. It's going to get managed somewhere. So, but just breath of fresh air. And it's not as though we don't have models going on right now all over the country. Really great examples.
Trade, immigration, and wars, I think he's on the popular side of. I think the country hates all these wars. The establishment in both parties has been supporting those wars, including Hillary. The fact we don't have an immigration system that we enforce. Business doesn't want one because they want the cheap labor. Democrats want the jobs and want the votes. Nobody's gotten it together. In terms of trade, the fact is, a good part of the states we're looking at tonight, just drive through Michigan, drive through Wisconsin, and you'll see places that are hollowed out. There's nothing left. There used to be a Blockbusters movie place to get videos. Yeah. They're gone. Now nothing's left but the diner. That's all that's left to hold the community together. And to,
Her life is meaningless if she doesn't get at least a shot. And one can only sympathize. Unless you think, as I do, that people should be distrusted who are running for therapeutic reasons. Because the presidency doesn't calm those demons, as her husband has already proved. But look, the reason why we have to think about it, and the reason why your question is a good one, is this. What else can the Democrats do? And if that's the case, what the hell shape are we in?
It still divides us as between those of us who think that a job must be found for Hillary Clinton, that the country would be somehow disgraced if she wasn't in an important position, and those of us who could do without her. And neither answer to that question is going to make any difference at all to the way the market performs.
The question of
if there was some foreign policy experience or brilliance that Hillary Clinton had ever shown, maybe we overlook the fact that she and her husband have never met a foreign political donor they don't like and haven't taken from.
Look, this is the woman who played the race card on Barack Obama. This is the woman who, if you were for change that you can believe in, whichever change it was, you were voting against. This is the woman whose foreign policy experience consists of making a fool of herself and fabricating a story about Bosnia. This is the woman who, with her husband, have so many connections, fundraising connections overseas, Indonesia, China.
Just look at today's and yesterday's New York Times at the list of people with
In
whom
modern
the former President Clinton has acquired a tremendous burden of debt. These are people who pay him all the time, from odd parts of the Middle East to strange donors all over the place. My colleague at Vanity Fair, Todd Purdom, anyone can Google this, just put in Purdom Clinton. See if you can bear to read the sort of friendships that a former president is having. It's undignified to think about it. From the Riyadi family in Indonesia to numerous Chinese donors who left this country rather than show up for the hearings on it. But I don't know of any such expertise on her part, except her pretense to have been under fire in Bosnia when she had not.
Actually, when there was pressure on the Clinton administration, when Les Aspin was Secretary of Defense, you remember, to do something about Sarajevo, to stop the killing, to prevent the ethnic cleansing, Hillary Clinton moved in hard on her husband and said, don't you do a thing about Bosnia, it'll spoil my wonderful health care plan.
At least on healthcare, she knows enough about the subject to have really changed American healthcare for the worse in her time. But foreign policy, she doesn't even know that much.
But I am very suspicious when John Kyle, a major supporter of the war in Iraq, a complete hawk, a neocon in many ways, complete hawk, supports her for this. Henry Kissinger's come out of the woodwork. He supports her for this. Why do these establishment as conservatives want her? What are they up to? Why do they want her? I don't know what they want.
Don't compare Kissinger to Kyle. I mean, Kissinger is a critic of the war and a so-called realist and someone who likes leaving.
Well, why do they both want her? They're both Republicans. Why do they want her?
Because she's a status quo type and they know they can, so to speak, trust her. She's a member of their club.
To remind people at this point of the lowest stage of the Clinton administration, when Eric Holder signed off at the Justice Department on the pardon of this fugitive, shall we call him financier, who'd also given a rather large loan that didn't seem to have been repaid to one of Hillary Clinton's brothers, who in turn, with the other brother, had gone for a walnut monopoly, or was it a hazelnut monopoly in the Republic of Georgia, odd bits of the Caucasus involved in American foreign policy here, plus donations to the Clinton Library. It builds up and it goes on. Is this how the President-elect really wants to start?
The amazing brothers of hers who nearly got the nut monopoly in Kazakhstan or something farcical like that. Just look it up. It's a ludicrous embarrassment for the president and for the country.
You were asked and talked about the qualifications of your nominee for Secretary of State, and you belittled her travels around the world, equating it to having teas with foreign leaders, and your new White House counsel said that her resume was grossly exaggerated when it came to foreign policy.
Look, I mean, I think this is fun for the press to try to stir up whatever quotes were generated during the course of the campaign. No, I understand, and you're having fun. If you look at the statements that Hillary Clinton and I have made outside of the heat of a campaign, we share a view.
Can I just add, though, that I thought Obama's answer just there was incredibly cheap and evasive. I mean, he was right the first time to say this woman doesn't, in fact, have any foreign policy experience, and he could have added, which also came up in the campaign, that the experience she has claimed, such as in Bosnia, was fake, was fabricated. And he could also have added that she, like his other nominee for the Attorney Generalship, main qualification in politics is being a friend of Mark Rich, which I don't think has changed. As I say, if it hadn't involved her too, the campaign finance scandals, we're not talking about the ongoing stuff, Mr. Clinton's huge speaking fees in the Gulf and elsewhere, talking about previous convictions in the Clinton fundraising scandal. If it wasn't for the fact that she couldn't refuse her brothers everything, or sorry, anything, couldn't refuse them anything they wanted, they seem to have got, including some kind of deal for Mark Rich. All of this might be forgivable, or it might assume a different proportion, David, if it wasn't for the fact that this woman doesn't really have any foreign policy experience worth mentioning. And what is memorable about it is pretty bad.
Remember, Kissinger had to decline the honor that Bush wanted to give him of being chair of the 9/11 Commission because it would have involved mentioning the names of all the people who he had business dealings with around the world. And he wasn't willing to do that with Kissing Associates. He didn't want to expose his clientele.
Okay, will he accept the deal?
The same thing, believe you me, is going to come up. She's been very, 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 very uncritically pro-Israel, though, at all times.
It's true that she's got a major name on the world stage. That's true by definition. It's only true that she's respected in the Pentagon if people go around saying so. I'd never heard that before, I must say. On some things, she's more hawkish than the president-elect, yes. But she tends to have acquired this reputation in what I'd call an opportunist manner. I mean, who really thinks that she felt that strongly about Iraq? She just didn't want to cast her vote the other way.
He's not worried about that. I genuinely think if he's got an eye toward politics, it's global politics, and he wants the strength of the Clinton name, the Clinton brand.
That's what the Secretary of State is for. And what you want as president is to know your Secretary of State spends all her time working to make sure that your policies stick. With this woman, that can't be said. She's always thinking first about herself, second about her husband.
What about her husband?
I trust Barack Obama will play more than yours.
Christopher, last question here.
That's never changed. That's never changed, and it's never going to. So he won't have.
That's your opinion,
nor will anyone. Well, guess what? Guess who's saying it? That's a very clever thing to say. Should I ask, would you prefer I uttered your opinion? What a fatuous remark.
Christopher.
After Mr. Trump's remarks were broadcast, Mr. Trump denied that he ever acted on the words that he used on the Access Hollywood tapes with Billy Bush. After his denial, a number of accusers came forward alleging that Mr. Trump had, in fact, assaulted. What do you mean? What do you mean?
Continue to speak out and tell the truth. The truth is always the right option and will win out in the end.
What do you mean? What do you mean? I've held this news conference several times.
Brought forward women. You've not taken any legal action yet, though. At what point will you do so?
Okay, I haven't held this news conference previously. I'm holding this news conference today. I have not asked him to retract previously. I'm asking him to retract today.
So how long will you give him?
And now it's his turn to decide whether or not it will be one of his priorities to sue the women, or does he wish to retract? And then we'll see.
Are you considering bringing any?
Politics, particularly in the United States, the terms liberal and progressive are often used interchangeably. These political positions are often treated as if they're synonymous, when in fact they are mutually exclusive, and I'd like to demonstrate to you why that is. I'm going to use Wikipedia to define these terms, and where I can't use Wikipedia, I'm going to use the dictionary. I want to use definitions that are not esoteric. I want to use definitions that almost everyone is going to be familiar with. Liberalism is a political philosophy or worldview founded on ideas of liberty and equality. Liberals espouse a wide array of views, depending on their understanding of these principles, but generally they support ideas and programs such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, free markets, civil rights, democratic societies, secular governments, corporate, which includes access to free markets and laissez-faire trading, freedom of expression, which encompasses freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought, and political freedom in a democratic society. If you do not uphold these principles, you are not a liberal. Let us begin with the very root of liberalism, individualism. Individualism is the moral stance, political philosophy, ideology, or social outlook that emphasizes the moral worth of the individual. Individualists advocate that interests of the individual should achieve precedence over the state or a social group. while opposing external interference upon one's own interests by society or institutions such as the government. Individualism is often contrasted with totalitarianism or collectivism. Possibly the most important principle of individualism is personal liberty. This is the freedom of the individual to do as he pleases, limited only by the authority of politically organized society to regulate his action to secure the public health, safety, or morals, or other recognized social interests. Put simply, it is the principle that allows someone to operate freely within society as long as they are not breaking any of its laws. Which is why we need to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and Bernie Sanders. Black Lives Matter is an activist movement that began in July 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman after shooting black teenager Trayvon Martin. It's difficult to accurately characterize disparate hashtag movements, but I think it's safe to say that the Black Lives Matter activists are all very concerned with perceived police brutality against African Americans in the United States. Although not originally a progressive movement, the Black Lives Matter movement fit very neatly in with progressive principles, and gained almost universal acceptance with progressives, and is now one of the causes that they champion. On August 8, 2015, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders hosted a campaign rally in Seattle where he attempted to give a speech.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
Barely had these words come out of his mouth.
We're doing a 4.5 minute moment of silence for Mike Brown as soon as everybody is silent. We'll shut it down. Get out of my face.
So where did this leave Bernie Sanders? Well, it left him standing on the sidelines of his own rally after it was completely co-opted by these activists for their own political purposes. And in doing so, progressive media has absolutely failed to explain why this is happening. Here's Vox's reasoning for you. So after being interrupted in Phoenix, Sanders said, "I've spent 50 years of my life fighting for civil rights. If you don't want me to be here, that's okay." Note the language that Sanders is using. He's talking about himself as an individual. But the progressive explanation for this is entirely collectivist, and so they end up talking past each other. White progressives can often ignore issues that disproportionately affect people of colour. As progressives, they think of themselves as defenders of people of colour and other marginalised groups, so when they're challenged on their anti-racist bona fides by activists of colour, they tend to react with disbelief, defensiveness, or outright hostility. None of this is speaking to the concerns of the individuals within the crowd. Hell, some of them even shouted out what their problems were.
How dare she call me a racist? I won't pen.
How dare she call me a racist? Not how dare black people call white people racists. We are dealing with a liberal in the crowd there. And I think that the problem people had with these people interrupting Bernie Sanders is the same problem I have with it. It denies him his personal liberty to speak, which they had no right to do to Bernie Sanders as an individual, especially not for a remote, abstract principle that has absolutely no bearing on Bernie Sanders himself. Given that the protesters interrupting Bernie Sanders and demanding the use of his platform hadn't earned it, but were instead requisitioning it on the basis of their skin colour, that brings us to the second liberal principle that is under attack: equality of opportunity. Equal opportunity is the stipulation that all people should be treated similarly, unhampered by artificial barriers, prejudices, or preferences, so that important jobs should go to those most qualified, and not go to persons for arbitrary or irrelevant reasons, such as circumstances of birth, upbringing, friendship ties to whoever's in power, religion, sex, ethnicity, race, caste, or involuntary personal attributes.